one of the big hot button issues now is critical race theory being taught in the schools. And I heard this black parent saying how it teaches racism. No, it educates, right? Because what happens if you act as if racism doesn't exist? And I think, if I have a son and he's going out to the world and he's just naive that, as a black man, things are just inherently different. Point blank, period. He needs to understand that. His lack of understanding that could cost him his life. And I think for those parents that are like upper middle class, that being black experience is something different when you come from the inner city, per se, right? And so I think that the people that are speaking out against this are mostly, I'm willing to bet that most of them came from the upper middle class households, because um, you know, uh, anyone, in my opinion, it's like, why wouldn't you want your child to be educated and know that fundamentally this is something that we built, and especially when we're working on dismantling this very thing. So for me, I think it's imperative that we talk about it. I think we need to lead with this shit. We need to talk about, okay, if we're talking about it's just like we do with gender and all these different things, right? Race it has to be there because it's this monster that we fucking created. And now we have to deal with it. You can't just put it to rest. That's not how it works. So, and teaching kids how to navigate it, I think is really important, rather than just leaving them to the devices of the world. At least you can form some type of framework around it before they're really exposed to it and have to make decisions for themselves in real time. So for me, I think critical race theory is really important for us as a society, not just these children.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you went there, because that's kind of where I was going with it too. Just the other night, Bill Maher on his show, and it's funny, Bill Maher actually, he grew up very close to, in a school district that's very close to mine.
Oh, wow.
And it's been quite interesting to see him. I mean, obviously I wasn't around then, but quite interesting to see him rise. And he's from my area. But I say that because even though I disagree with him on a decent amount of things, as of late, I think he's been a pretty good voice of reason. And I think that even though now he's a lot more rich and famous, I think that he captures the feeling of a lot of the upper middle class suburban white people. And again, not trying to speak for all of them, but I do know many of them in my area. And I think he was saying, when it comes to critical race theory, and I agree with him on this, that most people, we feel like most people would be fine learning about the Black experience, learning about more about racism and some of those key things, and not just for African Americans, but also Native Americans and Asians as well. And I think that where there is a disconnect is amongst white people, where it just seems like, not necessarily that it's going to be reverse racism or that it's going to take over the entire history book, but it's like, it just seems like, maybe it's just the way that it's being marketed. It seems like it's a lot. It seems like if we go down the path of teaching the good things, right, which I think we both agree should be taught, that eventually it could turn into something a little bit different, and something that where it does go down the line of kind of reverse racism and blaming the wrong people and white shame and all this stuff. And it's almost like I kind of, and I don't want to switch topics, but I kind of liken it to like the statue debate, where it's like, yes, like there are some statues that are hateful that should be taken down, But then again, once you start taking down statues, when do we stop? Is, Lincoln and Washington and Teddy Roosevelt, like, yeah, like they were all flawed, but they did a lot better things in, especially like Lincoln and like a Teddy Roosevelt did things that were a lot better than, say, like a, one of the Confederate generals,
Mhm.
so it's like, once you start, I think that's the fear, if I'm making sense there.
Okay. So I think that the okay, and I get that, but the thing too is that, like, that's also like the white perspective too, because if from the black perspective, we didn't matter either way to these people, to where even the history that you guys can embrace and say, okay, well, that was good or whatever, it's like, no, we don't give a fuck because we were slaves. You know what I'm saying? It's like that doesn't hold as much weight. And so for a lot of these people, and then we talk about, for so long, the country stood on this. It's nice to see some acts of symbolism, right? Have to be made. So that does mean some of these statues and things have to come down, because I think it's a gesture of saying that we're leaning in the right direction. It's like when the presidents, exchange, when the new president comes in, they bring a gift for the old president, that type of thing. So for me, I just feel like, if even if it does, like, because there was nobody in power to say, well, if we started down this road of, kind of white people saying, if we start letting them in our restaurants, the next thing you know, they're gonna be in our houses. They're gonna be sleeping with our women. These are things that were being said, and these were the fears, that white fear at the time, right? And so even with going down this road, we have to kind of weigh things out. Okay, is the level of education, we know what the intent is. So that, for me, that's everything. So if we can stay focused on what the intention is in teaching this, right? It will never be able to cap all the fallout off, right? But we can minimize it. And that's all we can do as human beings. It's always going to be collateral damage. There are always going to be some, shortcomings. And I think that if we focus on what the intention is, then we come out and say, this is what because we'll build ways to prevent and to minimize the things that we're worried about, with the reverse racism and all that thing. I think just jumping in the way people are now, that's a greater concern with the way things are going now than if we were going down this road of being intentional and teaching, critical race theory and like I said, just being intentional about what we want the outcomes to be, rather than just everybody coming from so many different directions and just throwing shit against the wall. And before you know it, people are elbowing and there's all this infighting, and everyone's forgotten about the actual goals that we all should be working towards. Equality. Who the fuck is working against equality?
Right.
And that's my thing, is like, okay, how could you even, anybody asking for equality, how could you even deny that? That's a basic human right. How could you even begin in your mind to deny anyone that? So that's my thing, is if we're talking about real equality, and I think that is in all fairness, this ugly side of the history needs to be seen. It needs to be understood, where things come from to create even a greater tomorrow. So as nasty and sticky as it could possibly get, that's what we invested into it, right? We did this. So we have to accept that on the other side, this is what we're gonna see.